Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. I never thought the best advice I'd ever receive would come from watching my father lose half his business in a divorce. But that painful lesson saved me from financial ruin when my wife of 15 years disappeared one Sunday afternoon, only to serve me with divorce papers the next day. My name is Jimmy, and this is how my wife and her boyfriend expected to cash in on what they thought was my fortune, only to discover I had a surprise for them. The whole situation started on what seemed like a perfectly normal Sunday. I was in my home office working, and my wife, Victoria, said she was leaving for lunch with friends. We'd been married for 15 years, and while things hadn't been great between us lately, I never imagined she was planning to disappear from my life entirely. Victoria had been different over the past year or so. She'd lost her marketing job during the COVID pandemic and never really went back to work, even after the job market recovered. Instead, she seemed to spend her time doing everything aside from returning to work. She'd started treating our comfortable lifestyle as if it were somehow beneath what she deserved. What Victoria didn't understand was that our comfortable lifestyle wasn't the result of me having tons of money in my personal name. It was the result of a carefully structured business arrangement that I'd learned about from my father's painful experience. Back in 2010, my dad went through a brutal divorce with my stepmother that nearly destroyed him financially. He'd built a successful contracting business over 20 years, but because everything was in his name, he lost half of it in the divorce settlement. I'll never forget sitting in his kitchen after the divorce was final, watching this strong man who'd built a business from nothing tell me about having to sell his trucks, his equipment, and nearly everything he'd worked for. That's when he gave me the advice that would eventually save my financial future. Son, never put everything in your name. The person you're married to today might not be the same person you're dealing with in a divorce court. Taking that advice to heart, when my business partner Kevin and I started our consulting firm in 2013, we structured it in a way that protected my assets while still allowing me to benefit from the business's success. On paper, Kevin owned 60% of the company, and I owned 40%. But the reality was more complex than that. I had funded most of the startup capital through loans to the company, making me a creditor rather than just a minority owner. This structure was completely legal and properly documented, but it meant that my personal financial situation looked much different on paper than our actual lifestyle suggested. Victoria knew I had a business, obviously, but she didn't understand the ownership structure or how the finances worked. She just saw that we could afford a nice house, decent cars, and regular vacations, and she assumed that meant I was making big money. The business was doing well, especially after COVID, when companies needed help with digital transformation, but I'd been careful to keep the successful structure my father had taught me about. I never thought I'd need that protection, but as it turned out, Victoria had been planning her exit from our marriage for months, while I was completely oblivious to what was coming. Looking back, there were signs that Victoria was growing unhappy, but I interpreted them as temporary frustration rather than fundamental problems with our marriage. She would make sarcastic comments when I suggested we save money instead of spending it on expensive items she asked for. She often complains about our house not being in a prestigious neighborhood where her friends have moved to. These complaints had become more frequent and more specific as time went by. Victoria would point out houses for sale in expensive neighborhoods and ask why we couldn't afford something like that. She'd see luxury cars and make comments about how successful people drive better vehicles. When friends would post vacation photos from expensive resorts, she'd make pointed remarks about how some people get to travel in style. I tried explaining that my business isn't that buoyant to spend money the way she wants. I let her know that profits from the business needed to be reinvested back into the company, but Victoria seemed to think I was being unnecessarily cheap. She'd gotten it into her head that I was making much more money than I was actually taking home, and she couldn't understand why we weren't living like millionaires. The truth was that our comfortable lifestyle came from the business paying for certain expenses that benefited both the company and our personal lives. Our house was owned by the business. I had a home office and worked from home sometimes. Our cars were leased through the business as company vehicles. Our vacations often included business networking or conferences that made them partially tax-deductible. This allowed us to live better than my actual personal income would have supported. But it also meant that I didn't personally own most of the assets Victoria thought belonged to us. After our 13th anniversary, Victoria became increasingly distant and critical. She'd spend hours on her phone, always tilting the screen away when I walked by. She started going out with friends more often, usually with people I didn't know well, and when I'd ask, she'd give vague answers and change the subject. At one point, I suggested she update her LinkedIn profile, asking if she'd been networking. She got defensive and said she needed more time to figure out what she wanted to do. Our conversations became increasingly superficial and functional. We'd discuss household logistics, upcoming appointments, or practical matters. When I tried to initiate more meaningful discussions, Victoria would say she was tired or had other things to worry about. The physical intimacy in our marriage had also declined significantly. Victoria always had excuses. I respected her boundaries, but the complete lack of affection was becoming noticeable. We were living like roommates rather than a married couple. Despite all these changes, I never suspected infidelity or that Victoria was planning to leave. I assumed our relationship would improve with time, but I was wrong. On the day she disappeared, she seemed to be in a good mood, which I hadn't seen in months. Victoria spent more time than usual getting ready that day, spending extra time on her makeup and hair. She left around noon, saying she'd probably be back by dinner time. I continued working throughout the afternoon while she was out. Around 7 p.m., I started wondering when Victoria would be home. I sent her a text asking when she would be home. The message showed as delivered, but she didn't respond. By 10 p.m., I was getting concerned, so I called her phone. It went straight to voicemail, which was strange because Victoria always kept her phone charged and rarely let it die completely. I decided to call her friend to see if they were still together or if Victoria had mentioned her plans for the evening. She sounded surprised to hear from me and said she hadn't seen Victoria that day. When I explained that Victoria had said she was meeting her and other friends for lunch, Victoria's best friend became confused and said they hadn't made any plans. This was when I started to really worry. Victoria had lied about where she was going, and now her phone was going to voicemail. I tried calling again from my work phone, but the call went through normally and went straight to voicemail again. I realized Victoria had blocked my number, which was a shock. Why would she block me unless she was deliberately avoiding my calls? I started calling our mutual friends to see if anyone had heard from her. Everyone I called claimed they hadn't heard from Victoria and seemed surprised that I was looking for her. By 12 midnight, I was genuinely panicked. I searched through Victoria's belongings to see if I could find any clues about where she might have gone. That's when I noticed that some of her clothes were missing from her closet, along with her favorite jewelry and some personal items. It looked like she had packed for a trip, but there were still plenty of her belongings in the house. I spent the rest of the night alternating between worry and confusion. Part of me was concerned that something had happened to Victoria, an accident, a medical emergency, or worse. But part of me suspected that her disappearance was intentional, especially given the blocked phone number and the missing belongings. I checked our credit card accounts online, but there hadn't been any unusual activity. I searched through Victoria's social media accounts, but she had changed her privacy settings so I couldn't see her recent posts. Everything seemed designed to cut off my access to information about her whereabouts or activities. Monday morning, I decided I needed to file a missing person report with the police. I went to the station and explained the situation to the desk officer. He took down the basic information, but seemed somewhat skeptical about whether Victoria was actually missing or just choosing not to contact me. The officer asked if we'd been having marital problems, and I admitted that things had been tense recently, but nothing that would explain a disappearance. He explained that adults have the right to leave if they want to, and unless there were signs of foul play, missing person cases involving spouses were often just domestic disputes. Still, he said they'd make some calls to hospitals and check accident reports to see if Victoria had been involved in any incidents. He gave me a case number and told me to call if I heard anything or found additional evidence that something bad had happened to her. I went home feeling somewhat reassured that the police were aware of the situation, but still deeply worried about what had happened to my wife. I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't concentrate on why Victoria would choose to disappear. Around 4 p.m. that Monday, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a man in a suit holding an envelope. He asked if I was Jimmy, and when I confirmed my identity, he handed me the envelope and said, "You've been served." Then he walked away. Inside the envelope were divorce papers, along with a personal letter from Victoria. The divorce filing listed irreconcilable differences as grounds and requested spousal support, division of assets, and attorney fees. Victoria's letter was brief. "Don't look for me. I need to start over. This marriage is over. Please don't try to contact me or find me. My attorney will handle everything." I was staring at these documents, trying to process what had just happened. Victoria hadn't just disappeared. She had planned this entire scenario. She'd filed for divorce while still living in our house and pretending everything was normal. She'd lied about where she was going on Sunday, disappeared deliberately, and now was demanding money from me through her attorney. The relief that Victoria was alive and apparently safe was mixed with shock at the calculated nature of what she'd done. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or emotional breakdown. It was a premeditated plan to end our marriage in the most dramatic and hurtful way possible. Over the next few days, I tried to understand what had led to this situation. I kept replaying conversations and interactions from recent months, looking for clues I might have missed about Victoria's intentions. While I knew we'd been having problems, I never thought they were serious enough to justify this kind of deception and abandonment. A week later, I met with a family law attorney recommended by my business lawyer. The attorney reviewed the divorce papers and asked detailed questions about our marriage, our assets, and our financial situation. She was particularly interested in the business structure, and she immediately understood how it would affect any asset division in the divorce. The attorney recommended that I hire a private investigator to look into Victoria's activities leading up to her disappearance. She explained that if Victoria had been planning the divorce for months, there might be evidence of misconduct that could affect the settlement. She also wanted to understand Victoria's current living situation and financial resources. I hired a private investigator who specialized in domestic cases. The investigator was thorough and professional as she began her investigation immediately. Within 2 weeks, she had uncovered that my wife had been having an affair with another man for at least 6 months before she filed for divorce. The investigator managed to get evidence of these two together. The evidence showed that Victoria had been living a double life while still married to me. She'd been meeting her new man regularly. Most shocking of all, Victoria had moved in with him immediately after leaving her house. From the whole situation, it's apparent that they have been planning her exit strategy together. This information was painful, but also helped me understand what had really been happening in my marriage. Victoria hadn't left because of sudden unhappiness or depression. She'd been planning to leave me. The timing of her departure was calculated to maximize her legal position while minimizing any consequences for her affair. Armed with this evidence, my lawyer prepared our defense strategy. The adultery would significantly impact Victoria's requests for spousal support, and the premeditated nature of her abandonment would affect how the court viewed her claims about our marriage. Throughout this process, I found myself thinking frequently about my father's advice and feeling grateful that I'd structured my finances the way I had. Victoria was probably expecting a substantial payout from our divorce, but she would be disappointed by the reality of my actual financial situation. The asset disclosure hearing was scheduled weeks after she filed for divorce. I met my lawyer at the courthouse that morning, prepared for what would likely be an eye-opening experience. When Victoria walked into the courtroom with her new man, they both looked confident and happy, like they were about to collect a lottery prize. I watched them whisper to each other and occasionally laugh, clearly in good spirits about their prospects. Victoria's attorney had prepared extensive requests for asset division and spousal support. His filing demanded half of everything I own. It was clear that they expected to walk away with a substantial financial settlement. My attorney began the asset disclosure by presenting my personal financial documents, my checking account and my savings account. I own my 2019 Honda Civic outright, along with some personal items. The business ownership structure showed that I never owned any percentage of the consulting firm in my name. As my lawyer presented these numbers, I watched Victoria's expression change from confident expectation to confused concern. She was looking at her lawyer with questions in their eyes. Her lawyer stood up and argued that the numbers couldn't be accurate. He claimed that I must be hiding assets through the business structure and demanded additional documentation to prove where the money was actually located. He pointed out that our lifestyle during the marriage suggested much higher personal assets than what was being disclosed. My lawyer was prepared for this challenge. She presented all the documentation showing that I didn't own more than what I am presenting. Everything was legal documented and had been properly reported to the IRS for years. The judge reviewed all the documentation carefully while Victoria sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. Victoria kept whispering frantically to her lawyer, clearly unable to understand how I could be broke on paper while we'd lived comfortably during our marriage. When the judge asked my wife's lawyer if he had evidence that assets were being hidden, he admitted that he didn't, but maintained that the lifestyle during marriage suggested more assets should exist. My lawyer calmly explained how business expenses and the ownership structure had subsidized our lifestyle. The discussion then turned to the house, which my wife's lawyer requested be awarded entirely to Victoria. The business owned the house, and it wasn't part of my assets to share. However, my wife needed to be settled, but my lawyer presented evidence of her adultery and argued that her misconduct should affect any asset division. The judge agreed and ruled that Victoria was entitled to a far lesser percentage of what she should have received otherwise. Victoria's attorney requested a brief recess to discuss options with his client. When they returned, they accepted the settlement offer. The final settlement was far from what Victoria had expected. The judge denied spousal support due to the evidence of her adultery and Victoria's ability to work. After the hearing, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that my father's advice had protected me from financial ruin, but sadness that my marriage had ended in such deception and greed. Victoria had thrown away 15 years together for what she thought would be easy money, only to discover that the money she'd counted on didn't actually exist. The business structure that had seemed complicated and unnecessary had proven to be exactly the protection my father had warned me I might need. By keeping the majority of assets in the business and maintaining proper documentation, I had avoided the financial destruction that could have resulted from Victoria's calculated departure. In the months since the divorce was finalized, I've had time to reflect on what went wrong and what I learned from the experience. Victoria's affair and abandonment were painful, but they also revealed her true character in a way that nothing else could have. She was willing to deceive me for months, lie to my face daily, and then disappear without explanation, all for money that didn't actually exist. Looking back, I'm grateful that my father shared his painful experience with me and taught me how to protect myself from someone else's greed and poor choices. The business structure wasn't created because I didn't trust Victoria. It was created because I understood that people can change, and the person you marry might not be the same person you face in a divorce court. Victoria's disappearance and subsequent legal demands proved that my father's advice was worth following. She had counted on getting half of what she assumed were substantial assets, but she discovered too late that assumptions about other people's money are often wrong. The experience taught me that protecting yourself financially isn't about being suspicious or greedy. It's about being realistic about human nature and the way relationships can change over time. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who are planning to take advantage of us, and having legal protections in place isn't paranoia. It's just good planning. Most importantly, I learned that my father's bitter divorce experience, as painful as it was to witness, had given me a gift that saved my financial future. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from other people's mistakes, and being willing to learn from those lessons can make all the difference when you face similar challenges in your own life.